All right, so how are we doing? Ready for the weekend? Yes, I was reading your papers on Saturday and Sunday. I want to get them back to you by Monday, actually. Usually I like having everything in, and then I just kind of read through them and compare them and see general themes and general tendencies, maybe general misunderstandings. But I think I have about 21 of them in, and 4 people told me they're going to get them to me as soon as possible. So I might start reading some tomorrow, and I'll try and get them back to you by Monday. But, I think you guys have an idea of what I expect, but it'll still be helpful for you to have it before I give you your next assignment. Now, your next assignment, within the next 48 hours, I'm going to design it. Hi, Alessandro. Hi. Within the next 48 hours, I'm going to design essay number 3. And I'm going to, do the usual. I'm going to upload it. I'm going to send out a Blackboard message. All right. And then on Monday, we're going to discuss it. Sound good? We're entering now very interesting territory, ethics. Okay? How you figure out right and wrong. That is a huge, huge topic, very relevant. We have a Supreme Court nominee, Amy Barrett, who's being considered for the Supreme Court. And I just want to remind you that these legal issues are motivated by religious and ethical issues, right? So our study of ethics is crucial. Like if you thought the stuff we were doing earlier was irrelevant, we're about to get extremely relevant right now. And that's going to continue till the very end. Because after ethics, we're not going to do aesthetics much, but we're going to go to existentialism, which is, why don't I just hang myself, right? What's the value of life? Again, very, very relevant. How do you figure out the value of your life? Whether life is worth living, whether it's meaningful, whether it's substantial, that kind of thing. Okay? But guys, I started really thinking about preparing for today's lesson and the next weeks, and we've only got 6 weeks left now. I've designed the course such that you submit your final assignment on the last day, right? So you have no burdens. You can feel a burden lifted as you walk out of class. So that's the way it's designed. And that was intentional. So you can enjoy is that before or after Thanksgiving? Before, so you can enjoy your Thanksgiving and not be like, oh God, Professor Review is just the worst. But having said that, with only 6 weeks left, man, we have so much to cover. I've dedicated, so ethics is such a big topic that originally I had dedicated a week each to three big theories of ethics, because there's so much to talk about. Consequentialism, deontology, virtue ethics, each one of those is huge in the way you think about how to figure out right and wrong, and things that should be prohibited, and things that should be mandatory or required, duties, We've got so much to talk about. And then that's going to take up 3 weeks. And then right after that, we get into existentialism. And the course is over. So I had you read something about free will today. But I was thinking deeply about what's most helpful to you, both in terms of you learning a deeper understanding of philosophy, as well as what will prepare us best for this ethics that's coming. And I decided that I need to use today to really consolidate a lot of what we've already understood, and then touch a little bit on free will and a little bit on personal identity, because these things are crucial to ethics. Let me tell you why. If we don't understand free will properly, we will not understand why punishment is so controversial. You see why? If it turns out people don't have free will, the institution of punishment is not justifiable. You see why? Because of the concept of responsibility. You see what I'm saying? If we haven't discussed thoroughly what it takes for someone to be considered responsible for their actions, if we haven't really prepared you to understand that, then you're not going to understand people who say capital punishment and the death penalty should be abolished. You see what I'm saying? So I'm going to have to figure out some way today, instead of going deep into some particular text, I'm going to have to give you an overview of how to think about free will and how it's related to mind and body problem, how it's related to what we were just talking about, things like Hume's skepticism and Hume's induction and Hume's the problem with induction and the problem with necessary connection. I mean, there's so much to integrate, because if you understand those things properly, you can go faster the next 3 weeks, and we'll be able to cover a large number of topics, you know? But you need to understand how what's the burden with showing that someone is responsible for their actions? How do you show that? Again, personal identity. Remember we talked a little bit about gender, race, class, sexuality, and disability? That's hugely relevant to personal identity and ethics. Why? If you don't even count as a person, right? If you don't have the status of personhood, if you don't even count as a person, how in the world are you going to be considered responsible for your actions? Again, the same problem, but from a different angle. You see what I'm saying? A lot of our history is based on people being treated beneath the dignity that a person should have. You see what I'm saying? We've got institutions like slavery, and they were largely race-based in many cases. We've got institutions like marriage, where the woman was a piece of property. You see what I'm saying? So if we go through history and we're studying ethics, we have to understand how different ethical cultures, in different cultures, they had different ethical understandings of what even counts as a person. I mean, there's just so much to talk about here. So instead of us going deep into technicalities, I'd rather take a step back, give you a general story, an epic story about how all this stuff is related. And you can read on your own specific issues, but ethics is coming up and we have so much to talk about. So we have to talk about free will, we have to talk about personal identity. And I think that today, that's what I'm going to try and get through. The task for today is simply to prepare us for what's coming. Because remember, again, when we're covering ethics, another big burden we have is not only understanding free will and personhood, another burden we have is doing some examples, right? So ethics is a very practical topic. What's the ethics of abortion? What's the ethics of the death penalty? What is the ethics of something like, there's so many ethical topics. What's the ethics of homosexuality? What's the ethics of socialism? Ethics is so rich and so relevant too. So I want to spend most of our time the next 3 weeks really laying out the theory and then talking about some hypothetical examples that show the principles of that theory the best, and then talking about some actual examples. There's just a lot of work to do, okay? And I feel the burden, and I'm trying to make you feel the burden too, but in a good way, you know? I was actually thinking about this today, this word burden. I know I've used it a lot in this class. And I probably use it in a negative way, like, oh, life is so hard, life is a burden. And I remember I said something like religions came in the world to help us bear this burden or to lift the burden. And I think in the Gospels you can find something like cast your burden, right? So that might make it seem like religions are really about eliminating burdens. But I think that I made a mistake. If you look at whether it's philosophers like Socrates or great religious teachers like Jesus, who was a rabbi, it might be the opposite of what I said. Instead of religions coming to relieve us of our burdens, they might actually come to give us a burden and to make us feel like bearing a burden is a very noble thing, an honorable thing. Because taking the case of Socrates, this is someone who neglected his own affairs, neglected his family, neglected his financial status, neglected his duties as a father and a husband, And he dedicated himself to the public. He bore the burden of educating and waking his fellow citizens up. It was a duty, it was a burden, but he bore it with nobility, with honor. And you can see the same thing with Christ, too. Christ was born, he lived a full life, very spontaneous, very lively, full of vitality. He died on the cross. But I had an epiphany. I said, wait a minute, there's a third thing he did too, which is very symbolic. On his way to the cross, he carried his cross. That's symbolic, right? Bearing a burden. So I don't think that's just relevant to Christians. I think we should all take inspiration from Socrates and Jesus that when God assigns us a burden, then he'll give us the grace to bear it, and that it's an honor. That's what religion is about, finding things that need to be done in your society and doing them with honor and with the grace of your God, whoever your God is. So Socrates had his Greek gods, Jesus had his gods. If you read the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna is giving Arjuna a noble burden to bear. Guys, there's an entire branch of philosophy called philosophy of religion. It gets into these types of issues. What is religion for? Is it to bear a burden, lift the burden, or is it to give us a burden? We could have a whole semester just on that topic. But I just wanted to correct something that I said earlier. Maybe I was wrong, all right? Or there are different perspectives, whatever. All right, so let's get into it. So guys, I just want to finish up and finalize what we were talking about last time. We talked about Hume. Hume is extremely relevant to what we're about to talk about in ethics. Why? Because remember what the crux of what Hume did, his genius, is he pointed out an elephant in the room. He said, you guys are doing all this science and you've got fancy equations and whatnot. These equations represent certain aspects of reality, but not the aspects that the common people and the scientists think that it represents. So for example, with a fancy equation like F equals MA or P equals nRT, these kinds of things, people think that they are understanding nature at a deep level. So they think that when you got F and M and A, not only do you understand that they're correlated a certain way through mathematics, either as inverse relationships or proportional relationships or something like that, but they think they actually know something else, not just correlations, but actual understanding of how they relate to each other and how they influence each other. The key word is how. If you want to tell a story, if you want to explain something, you have to tell a story, right? How does this machine work? You know, how does this happen? How does this get done? That word how is powerful. If you understand how to do something, we're inclined to say, hey, you really know that thing intimately. Now, if you're claiming that you know nature, you understand nature at a deep level, nature is no longer a mystery to you, then what you're claiming in effect is that not only do you know that two different variables influence each other, like pressure and temperature and volume or force and mass and acceleration. See, our empirical scientists, they can generate data that shows the relationships between those things. But that's the word, they're relationships, they're correlations. When you have one type of increase in one, you have another type of increase in the other. Or maybe you increase one and another decreases. Okay, science can get us that far. So that's a little bit, you've peeked behind the veil a little bit. But they go further. They say, we have explained nature. We have understood her at her core. And that's what Hume is reacting against. Because not only philosophers do that, not only scientists do that, but the common people do that too. Someone publishes a textbook that's all neat and tidy and has graphics and everything, and then you go and you get an education and you answer questions correctly that were posed in that textbook, and you walk away with a degree thinking that you know nature. And humans like, no, you don't. You understand correlations that can be articulated in equations, that's what you know, but you do not know how the force causes the mass to start accelerating. How does it do that? How can something like a force influence a mass to make it start accelerating? How can a hand influence a phone to make it start moving? How? Do you see that? You see the burden? This is the burden. Tell a story about how that happens. Is there a transfer of motion from one thing to another? Is there a transfer of potential energy from one thing to another? Is there a transfer of kinetic energy from one thing to another? Fine, you can speculate, you can speak, but can you tell a story that actually says how it happens? That's the burden that Hume is giving us. So when we say crime causes poverty, another way of saying that is crime influences poverty, or poverty influences crime. Poverty causes crime. Now, what you think you're saying is that you understand things that are happening. No, what you understand is that maybe in urban areas or something like that, sociologists have studied criminology and all that, and they've found a correlation that can be represented mathematically. So increases in poverty are correlated with increases in crime. But now there's a separate burden. After you've established that, now there's a new burden. How do you explain, or how do you tell a story about how the poverty actually influences the crime? Because in theory, it's possible to have in your mind a society where people are poor and they're all honorable, very moral, and they never steal, they never kill, or nothing. There are poor societies in the world right now where crime is rather low. Do you see what I'm saying? So the sociologists and the criminologists are discovering something, but one, it's not totalizing, it's not universal, and two, even what they've discovered is only a correlation. How do you tighten that into an actual story about how one thing influences another? Okay, so I'm just gonna wrap up. Hume is extremely important because he puts us back into our natural position of ignorance and awe and wonder at the mystery of nature. Maybe it's not a complete mystery, but it's mystery, it's a wonder and an awe at the ultimate mystery of nature. We don't know how nature works. Whatever we do in our labs, those are apparatus and setups that just generate information that we can express mathematically or otherwise. That's what the lab does, but it doesn't do anything more than that. It recreates the standard temperature and pressure and conditions under which the same experiment can be repeated. That's what a lab does. It controls variables, that's it. But people think something deeper is going on. Are you understanding what I'm saying? Okay. Now, let's relate this to where we're going. Guys, first of all, if we don't understand how one thing influences another, then I hope you can already see that burden is going to get reshifted into the free will discussion. You see why? If a human is taken to be accountable for his actions, responsible for his actions, then one of the leading stories we're going to tell about his responsibility is we're going to say he influences his actions or causes his actions. You see that? But according to Hume, we have a burden that we can't. How are we going to tell a story like that? We can't. Even from Descartes' perspective, there's a burden, right? Because if you're a dualist, you've got two substances that make up a person. You got the mind and the body. And I think, as crazy as Descartes is, most people believe they have both of these things. They might not use language like substances, but most people are comfortable saying, you know what, I'm a mind and a body. But the problem is interaction, once again. How in the world can something like a mind influence something like a body? How can it cause things in the body and vice versa? So even without Hume, we can already see problems on the horizon. Now, setting things up that way, we can go very quickly, all right? So today, we're going to try and get through two big issues in one class. Let's see what time it is. Okay, we've got 50 minutes. All right, I think we can do it. So we want to get through free will and determinism, and the aim is just for you to appreciate the burdens there. And then also we want to get through the problem of personal identity. What is it to be a person? And there's a whole bunch of burdens and issues there. And again, guys, the reason I'm emphasizing that the greatest thing you can walk away from this class with is not a conclusion or a dogma or a doctrine, but the feeling of a burden. The feeling that, hey, I as an educated person cannot walk around with convictions or prejudices or biases unchecked. The greatest thing I can get from an education is not a conclusion, but a disposition, a tendency to be open-minded, receptive to the information, and to interpret whatever data I get with critical thinking. That's about it. You might figure some things out along the way, that's great. I mean, I hope you have a legacy that's rich in whatever field you go into. But what a philosophy class should do is make you feel the burden, the general burden of what it means to be an open-minded, critical thinker, and that's it. So when I go through this material, I don't want to lose the forest with the trees. You see what I'm saying? The forest is critical thinking and open-mindedness on all possible subject matter. The trees would be like what one particular philosopher wrote in one book 20 years ago about one topic. I want to expose you to real philosophy, but if I have to choose, I'm going to do this general stuff that's consciousness raising over you getting lost in technicalities, because there's going to be some personality issues with that essay, some idiosyncrasies. Maybe he's eccentric, maybe he's religious, maybe he's an atheist. You can get lost. I want you to see the forest, don't get lost in the trees, okay? All right. So here's what we're doing. The problem of free will and determinism, stated in its most general form, is this. We assume, at just a common sense, intuitive level, we assume that people are responsible for their actions. Somehow, we just go around with a bias or a presumption or a prejudice that, hey, not everything that a person does, but a good number of things, a significant subset of the actions that a person takes, he or she is responsible for. Now, I'm setting it up that way because I already want to talk about that set. We have a set, and then we have a set within the set. We have a subset in a larger set. Guys, let's do an exercise. Let's start with the body. How many physiological systems can you name? And out of that total set of physiological systems, how many of them are automatic and how many of them are voluntary? You see where I'm going with this? How much of your own body can you control consciously and voluntarily? We've got this story going like human beings are autonomous. This comes from the Enlightenment, right? People like Kant, they thought we had this tremendous power to think for ourselves and control ourselves and design our own destiny, right? Leaving the Middle Ages, leaving the aristocracies that were oppressive behind, the new emerging middle class believes the sky is the limit. But since they are not necessarily relying on God anymore, they believe they can give themselves laws. They can control all aspects of nature. But guys, let's do a simple exercise. We've got a respiratory system, a circulatory system, a hormonal endocrine system. We've got a nervous system. We've got a skeletal system, a muscular system. What else? What am I leaving out? An immune system. How many of those systems are under voluntary control? Hey, what's up? How many of those are under voluntary control? Go ahead. Breathing? Yeah, you're right. Okay, fair enough. You can control your breathing. You can. What about your breathing can control? Let's get into that. You can control. You can't stop breathing. You can't say I'm not going to breathe, right?
Forever.
You can. You can for a few minutes, right? Okay. Let's be fair. Since I've introduced this problem, let's play with it a little bit. But it's supposed to suggest a bigger idea. Okay, how many aspects of yourself can you control? I think the muscular and skeletal is the obvious one, right? In terms of all the things you can control, I think the most obvious one is the muscular and the skeletal. Okay. Can you control your own thoughts and moods? It's a tricky one, right? Can you control your own beliefs and desires? Getting tricky, right?
I feel like definitely not.
Go ahead, Carter. What do you want to say?
I feel like definitely not completely. Like a lot of times, like just random thoughts just come on my mind and like not even like about.
I was thinking more along the lines of like yes, but also like people with mental disorders can take medication that does control that for them. So even though I guess you're not literally doing it, you're taking something else to do it for you, you still are controlling to some extent.
That's an excellent point, Sarah. What would you say about that, Carter?
Like, what do you mean like refuting that?
Okay, so you and I started talking about how you don't think, you and I kind of agree that we are out of control, even with respect to our own body. We're starting there because once we move out of the body and out of the mind into the world, it's going to get really questionable how much we can control out there. We can't even control most of what's going on in here. So let's start right here, body and soul. Let's assume, I know this is complicated and controversial. Let's just assume that there are these things called mind and body. Let's start with the body. How much can a person or human being control of his own body? So there are all these systems. Now, I'm calling them systems strategically. If you take biology, you'll understand that an organism, especially a multicellular organism, is organized into systems. So there's division of labor and differentiation. As that organism matures from a genotype into a phenotype, just like a flower blossoms, it kind of ripens or grows into itself. You know what I mean? But all of those systems are set up by the DNA to run on their own. Even, and this is where it gets really crazy, even the nervous system. A fully developed nervous system, central and peripheral nervous system. There's a way you can look at it in which it is working automatically. So, what does this mean? Every time a person claims or thinks or feels that he's doing something, a neuroscientist can always tell a parallel story in which, yeah, you feel like you're doing something subjectively, but objectively, I can trace the real agent, the real actor. You know what I mean? The real one who's doing the real influencing of your actions. So you got this dual story. You see what I'm saying, Carter? Now she brought up an excellent point. Sarah is saying, look, I see why you might say, oh, the program say, oh, we're just robots, we're just sophisticated machines. Nature created us through these evolutionary pressures, and natural selection refined us into this beautiful thing that you see in front of you. But no matter, don't be fooled by appearances. We might look like a machine, but if you think a bit deeper and we introspect, maybe we can come up with a competing story. She's complicating the story that we're starting off with, because she's saying, look, yeah, take someone who has mental health issues, right? That is a classic example. Someone who's neurotic and psychotic and all of that, they are not in control. You see what I'm saying? They're not in control of their thoughts. Yeah. But she's saying, you can get medical counsel and medical advice, and then you can develop a habit, a very regular habit of either therapy or pharmacological dosages or both, and you can regulate it. So Sarah has complicated our story. She's thrown a monkey wrench in it. Now I want you to respond to that. You think, you agree with me that we're out of control. She is complicating it a little bit. So how do you respond to that?
Well, yeah, I don't think we're completely out of control, and like I do agree with what she said that how that we can do like external things such as like medication to help, like, as an additional level of control over our bodies, just not just our thoughts, just not trying to think through like a mental disorder. Like, I don't think it's an absolute. I don't think that we aren't completely in control, or we're not. We just have to control. I think it's. I don't want to say like a percentage or something, but
All right.
I think it's not absolutes.
No, okay, good, yeah, not absolutes. But I want to focus on Sarah just for a minute. I'll come back to you in a second. Anyone else who wants to jump in, please do. Sarah, I want to complicate your story a little bit.
Okay.
Two things, two considerations. To the extent that we share DNA with animals to a large extent, not a very high percentage, but we're all nature's babies, nature's creatures, right? One thing we observe in animals in particular is instincts. When mating season comes, they can't control themselves. You get what I'm saying? They cannot control themselves because it's an instinct. Certain predators around certain prey cannot control themselves. You see what I'm saying? Aggression, reproduction. These are kind of like primitive instincts in the animal world. Now we are kind of continuous with the animal world. Aristotle calls us a rational animal. He says we are animals that have the ability to reason or think, but we're still animals. Okay? Now, Sarah, first thing I want to complicate for you is, do you think we are instinct-based? So I've already told you that we have all these physiological and anatomical systems that are kind of automatic. On top of that, I'm suggesting this weird thing called an instinct. I don't know how that fits into these systems. If you look at our hormonal system, our endocrine system, you got stuff like testosterone, right? Levels of testosterone do dispose males towards certain behaviors. Okay? That's the first thing. So I want you to think about, to what extent are we just as instinct-driven as the rest of the animal kingdom? When you look at an alpha male, when you look at masculinity, things like that, okay? Second thing I want you to think about is, what kind of story can you tell about the habits you develop to control your mental illness or your diet or whatever? Can you tell a story about that habit, that habituation, that can also suggest that even though you've adapted, you're still not fully in control even in that habit?
Well, first one about instincts, I think that personally that's what separates us from the animals. We still have the instincts sometimes. It's just like we can think about it and say like, is this a good idea? Like with the example about like mating season, like obviously humans seem to have a little bit more of the capability to be pickier about partners, even though technically I guess it's instinct to be attracted to someone, but then you think, well, he said something mean to me, so I'm not going to, get with him. So like, whereas animals, like, they don't speak, at least as far as we know, other than noises.
All right. I'm going to complicate what you just said. I want you to respond. What about competing instincts? So, what if there are many instincts and some emerge under certain conditions? And what we call reasoning and critical thinking, what if that is just several instincts that are balancing each other? You know what I'm saying? Like critical think, what is to be a critical thinker? You might, go ahead.
But I think it's assumed when people say instincts, it's like this irresistible urge from inside that you don't.
That's exactly what they mean.
So I think that even if the critical thought is a result of other instincts, it's almost too logical to truly be considered an instinct.
Because
instinct implies that you can't control it. Like it just happens.
I want to hear from some other people because what Sarah is suggesting is very, very good, but I want to get everyone involved. What do other people think? First of all, think about what I asked Sarah. I asked her about us, right? Like, how analogous are we, or how similar are we to the rest of the animal kingdom? The animal kingdom, let me tell you something about Descartes. He thought that all animals other than men were soulless. They were pure machines. They had no soul, no mind, no nothing. So he looked at an animal eating, mating, hunting, or whatever, and he saw nothing but primitive, natural urges that were just regimented by nature. Us, he thought differently. Go ahead.
I want to agree with what Sarah said about instincts not being completely, I don't know, logical. Because sometimes they are, but sometimes they're not, in my opinion. I think a lot of people, when they live unconsciously and are driven by instincts that get down from society more than used to. So instead of being nature, saying, I'm going to get food, I'm going to make, I'm going to raise cubs, and I'm going to grow old and die, it is kind of a more habituated thing by complexity that humans have. So like institutions we face, we have to do for work, different things we have to learn.
I love where you're going with that. There was a great philosopher called Rousseau. Have you heard about Rousseau? Rousseau was a great philosopher for many reasons. Partly because he started a reaction against the Enlightenment, known as Romanticism. Basically, he said, we've gone too far with this worship of reason and intellect and all that. There's a much more natural way of being, and that is a way of living according to your feelings rather than how you think. Don't calculate and measure everything. Certain things are sacred because they're just a matter of pure feeling. And the intensity and the passion of the feeling is way more sacred than all this, equations and all this kind of like autonomy. No. We shouldn't be autonomous. We are at the mercy of all the beauty in nature and all the wonderful passions she's put in our soul, that kind of thing. Now that's directly related to the other thing I was going to say, which you brought up, which is, if it's true that nature is wonderful, right, and innocent, and we're at our best when we're naive, if that's true, then exactly what you said becomes relevant, right? Because what happens in society? Let's break down this thing called society. Rousseau, when he sees society, he doesn't see what a sociologist sees. He sees something very specific. He sees, quote unquote, civil society or civilization. And exactly what you said comes into play, right? In civilization, you're forced to do artificial things like work long hours, right? He loves Sparta or the Native Americans. Why? Because they're natural. The Spartans are natural because their instincts are very manly. It's patriarchal. They just train, their whole society is based on patriarchy. Military. You train a young boy to become a dominant alpha male on the battlefield, and if you suspect at birth that he can't do it, you kill him. Yes, they used to throw away young babies who they thought were sickly and would bring down the community. So this is no joke. Now, but there's naturalness in it. There's something natural about that. Now, at the other end, with the Native Americans, when people were civilizing, when people were creating the United States of America and colonies, what you were seeing was interactions between Puritans and savages, so to speak, right? The Europeans refer to these Native Americans as savages because they're uncivilized. But Rousseau, after the Enlightenment, is saying, wait a minute, those weren't savages. They were noble. Why were they noble? Again, just like the Spartans, they were territorial, but they didn't have agriculture. They went out and hunted regularly. They didn't have refrigerators and all that. They weren't studying systems of, working for 30 years and then retiring. That's very artificial. They lived day to day in the moment. And when their energy ran out, they died. They lived short but very brilliant lives. They didn't have all this medicine and all this stuff that just keeps your life going and going and going. Why take pride in living to 150 years old if there's a natural thing that's going to start happening in your 60s and 70s? Yeah, you might hit 150, but what will you look like? How will you gasp when you breathe? Whereas if you live naturally, well, you'll die either of war or some natural disease. You'll reproduce very quickly. You'll get married very quickly. and life will be very unpredictable and turbulent, but there's a beauty in a storm. And in fact, one of the things Romanticism did is it glorified nature in its most destructive and violent and uncontrollable aspects. So Rousseau started his career by writing a brilliant essay, which said, civilization and learning and academics, philosophy, all these things are so artificial that they are enemies to true morality and true religion. He accused philosophy, the Enlightenment, all of this stuff as creating artificiality that is an unnecessary burden and in fact corrupts innocent and naive primitive people. This is very important to what we're talking about, because one of the things I gave Sarah to think about is, okay, so civilization gives us the opportunity to quote unquote control ourselves. But what if that very control is just one more pattern of behavior? You might be able to learn it and adapt using it, but that's now one more story that you can tell purely in terms of not being in control. You see how you can tell a competing story where your nervous system may be adapted in some way, and so automatic processes that are new from the old ones began. And so what we're calling habits that seem like control, to a neuroscientist, he's not going to be intimidated by that. He's going to say, yeah, the nervous system has plasticity. It can adapt. So when we need to control ourselves, we can learn new habits, and the nervous system can adapt by doing things like taking lithium every evening or seeing a therapist twice a month. The neuroscientist isn't going to be like, whoa, that's too much. I think you've proved that we're free. No, he's going to be like, yeah, any behavior that you adopt new or that you change to, you can always tell a corresponding story purely in terms of the nervous system. Sarah, do you see where I'm going with this? How would you respond?
You're right. I was kind of just trying to be a devil's advocate. I don't think we can necessarily control it all. I'm just saying there are cases in which I think we can control it to an extent.
So what if that word control can always be replaced by adaptation? Like a biologist would say, that organism just adapted. Now, this organism has a huge cerebral cortex, so it adapts through language and manipulation, but fundamentally, it's no different than a bee or an ant adapting.
Yeah, I guess. I don't know if I like the word adapt because I usually associate adapt with like species as a whole adapting to something, whereas I think when it's on an individual level and it's not going to get passed on to like.
Not hereditary.
It's not hereditary, so I think more like you just change or learn more. So
Okay, let's use learning then. Guys, you've heard of Pavlov's dog, right? Conditioning. That's a kind of learning, a very primitive kind of learning. Now, think about the neuroscientific story you can tell to make sense of Pavlov's dog, right? You ring the bell, and nothing happens because the dog doesn't associate the bell with anything. But every time you feed the dog, you're ringing the bell, and after a few times, it learns. Every time it hears the bell, it salivates, it comes looking for the food, you see what I'm saying? So it's learned, right? But maybe we have this sublime notion of what it is to learn, as if it involves freedom or agency or something like that. But what Pavlov is understanding is that at a psychological level, there must be a very simple mechanism that associates two different things in your nervous system, and you can tell a very deflationary story about what learning really is. See what I'm saying? So once again, you reintegrate an external habit back into the nervous system, and you can have automation, you can have determinism. Do you guys see where I'm going with this? All of this is an effort to just raise your consciousness about how difficult it is to go one way or another conclusively on the free will versus determinism debate. Let's get into it. So, clearly, right? Clearly, if you have a gun and you're about to shoot someone, if someone else comes and presses your finger on the trigger, are you responsible for shooting that person? No, some external person did it. So clearly, you are not responsible for shooting that person. Now, what if someone says, that was an external cause, now let's go internally. What if someone says, you know what causes people to do things are their intentions and their motives and their beliefs and their desires. That's what really does the causation. And that's what really influences actions. So what if someone were to say, you know what? A man and his intentions and motives and beliefs and desires are two different things. And people should not be responsible for their own desires or beliefs or motives or intentions. For those of you going to law school, yes, I'm looking at some of you, you're going to have to face these kinds of ideas, right? Because there's a difference between premeditated murder, something you thought about years ago so you could get the insurance money, versus walking in and you're like, oh my God, nudity, and what are you doing with my husband? And you just start shooting. You see the difference? So, in one case, the beliefs and the desires are very distant and very premeditated. And then in the other circumstance, it's more like a reflex. And a reflex seems automatic. See what I'm saying? Guys, these burdens are practical. This is not pure theory now. If you're in a trial, and you're trying to demonstrate that someone did something with cruelty and with utter rage and hate, you know, being able to tell a compelling story to the jury to generate feelings of pity and feelings of revenge is very powerful, right? Now, you can do that effectively if you have understood just how out of control we really are, or just how sober and self-composed we can sometimes appear to be. And you can use that to play on the jury. Of course, you're going to have to select the right people in the jury who are going to get the right reaction you want. Are there any questions? All right. So here's where we're going. There are three different schools of thought you need to know about free will. The first one is determinism. A determinist is someone who says, no human being ever causes his own actions. No human being ever causes his own actions, all right? No human being ever causes his own actions. His actions are fully determined by other events. That's what it means to be determined. And that's what it means for there to be determinism. Determinism says either the individual himself, the self, does not exist at all, and so, since there's no self around to even cause any action. Or the self exists, but it's fully integrated into the series of causes in which one event causes another, causes another, causes another. Kind of like Aquinas, remember Aquinas? The whole universe has a prime mover, an original cause, and we're just like dominoes being flipped over. You can go that way too. But either way, it's going to turn out that those things that you isolate artificially and call acts or actions, there's just no way to show that that's actually caused by something called the self or the person or the human being. The act is artificially isolated and the self is artificially isolated. And connecting the two is a burden. That's all I need to say. If you can understand what I just said, you've got the idea of the problem with showing that people have free will. Do you understand? Does anyone have any questions? All right, let's move on. Let's go to the other side. So there's a bunch of philosophers, people like Spinoza. Spinoza was a determinist. Depending on how you read Leibniz, you might consider him a determinist. A great philosopher known as Schopenhauer, he was a determinist. So yeah, I mean, some philosophers think this thing called nature is very rigid and fixed, and it's all a bunch of dominoes of atoms influencing atoms in a very mechanical, automatic way. And that's determinism. That's a world view. That's one way of looking at this world about it. Just like dualism and idealism and materialism, Yes, determinism is one worldview, one theory. The word theory is a Greek word for view. So one theory of the world is that it's fully determined. All right, another theory at the opposite end is the people who believe in free will. All right, these are known as libertarians. Libertarians. A libertarian is a equivocation. It can mean something in philosophy and metaphysics, and it can mean something in politics. We're not going to talk about the politics. It's related. Libertarians really value liberty, both physical, economic liberty, as well as social liberty, right? But we're not going to get into the politics. Let's focus only on metaphysics. And by the way, while we're at it, why is this a metaphysical topic? Well, it's metaphysical because of Hume. Hume said, yes, you can see one thing and having an effect on another. You can see a cause having an effect on another thing. But you cannot actually see the influence itself. All we can do is register when I change some variable here, some other variable here changes. But you can neither see, perceive, or have an idea of the actual influence. And once you can't do that, no amount of Socratic method or technology or definition is going to get you there either. Because all concepts are abstractions, you know? You don't see bachelors, right? You see human beings, and then you might be in a language, in a linguistic system that labels certain people as bachelors based on other attributes. But that's very artificial. Language is a very artificial thing. And language is symbolic, and concepts are symbolic. You don't see concepts, you see ideas, right? But if you don't see concepts, then this thing called necessity, this thing called necessity is a concept. You do not see the necessity or the influence of a force on some object. You just never see that. And as far as the definitions and the conceptual abstractions, you don't see anything there either. All you're doing is calculating or inferring. But as I said before, that doesn't mean much, doesn't add up to much. Because the only things that you truly define easily are things that are trivially true. Bachelors are unmarried males. Yeah, okay. That's necessarily true. There's necessity there, big deal. But can you demonstrate the necessity in something like there is plenty of diamonds and gold in South Africa? Does the word South African necessarily link itself to the presence of gold? Right? There's a lot of liberty and equality in America. Can you show necessity there? Can you show the influence or the causation there? You cannot. Because they're purely empirical. You have to be in America to see the liberty and equality, and you have to be in South Africa to see the gold and the diamond. There's no other way. If you don't perceive it, there's no way to define it into existence. You see that? All right, moving right along. So these libertarians are people who say, look, I have a feeling, I have an experience of my own liberty and my own agency. I can feel myself raising my hand. I'm not feeling the hand, I'm feeling myself influence the hand. There, just like some people say they have revelations and personal religious experiences, there are people who argue, wait, we're making this too complicated. One of the ideas I have in my mind is the idea of my influencing my hand. So they'll say the argument from experience or the argument from deliberation, the fact that people actually make decisions, they have an experience of decision making. I actually had to think, do I want to go to UM? Well, they argue that if I didn't have influence over my decision, I would never have the experience of deliberating and deciding, agonizing, is it UM or is it USF? I don't know. What they're going to argue is that experience is unintelligible or does not make sense unless there were actually something like a real influence happening. But guys, there's a problem there. So the burden to be met with showing determinism is that, yes, you can say that nature is automatic and just one big machine. But Hume has given us a burden where you can say that, but if you're claiming that everything is determined and that events just influence each other, You can't show that influence. So it's just a claim or an assumption. And then on the other side, if you say that I feel free, I feel like I'm in control, I feel like I'm influencing my actions through decision making or something else, someone can always come back and say, yeah, I mean, those feelings are subjective for one thing. So they don't describe the objective world. So they're subjective for one thing. And two, there are actually studies that show that a lot of our decisions and our deliberate actions come before, they're initiated before we become conscious of them. Think about that. Neuroscientists have designed very delicate experiments in which they time everything related to some action. So there's the moment when you perform the action, then they work backwards, and they time the moment when you become conscious of the action, and then they also time the moment at which the nervous system began acting and sending motor signals to all of the muscles and everything like that. And what their study revealed is amazing. You think you're in control, right? Now, one of the assumptions we're going to make is if you decide to do something, then you must have been conscious of it before it started happening, right? There's a kind of temporal order. If you did something, then you must have decided it and become conscious of it before the series of events that led to it happened. But neuroscience shows we have reason to believe the contrary, which is what? You don't become conscious until the actual system has already started running. The pattern of events in your brain has already triggered and started firing, and you become conscious later, and then you complete the action. What does this suggest about determinism and free will, guys? Anyone want to jump in here? How do you interpret that data? Yeah, go ahead, Don.
I feel like science is kind of a trend of picking apart free will and kind of crediting our actions to the biology that we have.
Absolutely. That's absolutely right. That's the trend. And so, yeah, guys, you're right. You're very, very right. And then there's the middle. There's the middle category called compatibilism. And I want someone to please volunteer what the word compatibilism suggests. This is, as a matter of basic dictionary English, compatibilism. When you hear the word compatibilism, what comes to mind? Go ahead, Carter.
I don't know, I guess if it's like thinking determinants with free will, saying like there are a series of events that cause you to realize that, but and there's exists some like your own free will in your own systems that are compatible.
Exactly. That's exactly right, Carter. Exactly right. So some people say, no, there's no contradiction between these two things. They can coexist. They're compatible. And that's that. We won't get into the details of all the philosophers who have ever written about compatibilism. At this point, I'm just trying to raise your consciousness that there's a burden if you claim determinism. There's a burden if you claim libertarianism. And even compatibilism, that's a popular place for people to rest, but it's a burden. You never escape burdens, all right? Just like you do critical thinking on others, when others see you slacking off or getting slothful or needing some rest, and you just take a conclusion unbiased, with bias, others will do critical thinking on you and light a fire under you. And be like, hey, it's kind of arbitrary that you criticize everything else and you stop here. You know what I mean? All right, let's move on to personal identity, guys. I think I've given you an overview of free will and determinism, and I did mention one reason why it's so relevant for ethics, right? I just want to remind you, if there is no free will and determinism is true, we have a lot to think about in terms of the institution of punishment, especially capital punishment, all right? All right, so moving on, personal identity. Guys, this is a very, very important topic. What is a person? As I was saying before, guys, even just looking at history, it should give you a lot of things to think about. What makes a person? What identifies you as a person? Which one should it be? Should it be your gender mostly? Are you just your gender? Is that sufficient to define it? Is it your race? And race is another very complicated thing, especially if you think about race in the context of culture. Here's what I mean. Madonna, and who is okay. Jennifer Aniston was married to him. And who did he remarry? Okay. I think Jen and Brad did not have any children, right? But when he married Angelina Jolie, that couple, along with, just like Madonna, they adopted a whole bunch of African children. I think Madonna from Malawi, and I think like if you look at Angelina Jolie's family, it's very multiracial. A couple of babies from somewhere in Africa. Here's what I'm about to say. It's going to make you think about what I'm talking about. If you take a very young infant from Africa and you raise them in Beverly Hills, and they learn American language, they're around American people, watching American TV shows, you can see why by the time they enter society, either after their bar mitzvah or they graduate from college or whatever, a lot of people might question, really? You're black? You see what I'm saying? This thing called being a certain person, if we use the factor called race, what I'm complicating for you is this. Race might be a variable that depends on another variable called culture. You see what I'm saying? The culture you're born into might actually determine what race you really are. This happens with Asian immigrants here, this happens with African immigrants here, Latino immigrants here. What I'm trying to say, guys, is what we're studying about what it is to be a person is not complicated just because there are many factors that independently make a person. It's even more complicated because each one of these individual factors might influence each other. So a person with a certain skin color might be born with a certain gender or race, but then they might be raised in a certain culture. And all of that influences what kind of person we're going to call them. You see that? The variables are many, and they're all interrelated. They're influencing each other. So how do you identify a person? It's a very interesting topic. How do you identify a person? Which factor is most important? And which one is sufficient to define him? Which one is necessary to define him? And which set or subset is both necessary and sufficient to define him? Which are the essential things that make up a person? And which are the non-essential things? So, for any person, which are the qualities or properties that you can change and he'll still be a person? And which are the qualities and variables that you cannot change, because if you change them, you would no longer be a person? Are animals persons? If you see a UFO and someone comes out of the UFO looking quite crazy, but they can speak and they sound conscious, like they have their own subjectivity, is that a person? Take me to your leader. Is that a person? And if you evolve some artificial intelligence, have you seen Ex Machina? You evolve some artificial intelligence that's so smart that you cannot tell the difference between their intelligent behavior and our intelligent behavior. And they pass something called the Turing test, where you can't tell the difference between that machine and a human being. Does intelligence alone qualify you as being a person, or is there an extra burden? Does an extra burden sound? Go ahead.
I think the extra burden is that even though you can maybe think just like a person, doesn't mean you have the same experience as like the machine, even though machines eventually break down and stuff, just like humans eventually age and die. they would go through a totally different feeling and process when it happens that would not be relatable to a human.
Ah, very, very good. So is it necessary to be a person, in order to be a person, is it necessary that you be human? Is that what you're committed to?
I think so, yeah.
So all persons are human beings, but not all human beings are persons. Do infants count as persons? Do very old people count as persons? Do people in comas, are they still persons? Mentally disabled people, are they persons? Quadriplegics, amputees? So what's the real thing? What is it about us? 'Cause it looks like you're comfortable with us losing parts of our body, we're still people. We can have mental disorders, and we're still people. We might not even be very intelligent, and we're still people. And of course, I'm assuming gender and race doesn't matter to you. Carter?
Or did you include like emotion in there?
What?
Did you include emotion in that earlier? Like emotion?
Oh, emotion, that's great. Yeah. No, I didn't include it. So you think in order to truly be a person, you need to have emotion? That's a very important thing. You know why? Because if you don't have the capacity to feel pain, and especially physical pain, but even emotional pain, then you might not be a candidate for being a person. You know why? Because one way of thinking about a person is someone who has moral standing. A person is a very dignified thing. He's a member of society, he's a citizen. You dignify a person. Like, you need to take a person seriously. They have moral qualities that entitle them to human rights. Maybe we can call them person rights, right? A person is like sacred, okay? But what makes them sacred, Carter, is what you're suggesting. You can hurt them. You can hurt their feelings. If you enslave them, they get depressed. If you treat them like property, they feel bad. And it's their emotions that are processing that. You know what I mean? So you're absolutely right. We need to think about emotions. What about something like in the future? I don't know. Charles Xavier and Magneto, right? So if mutants evolve in our civilization, would you be comfortable saying that they are persons? Sarah?
I was just gonna say that I think it depends on what level of mutation it is.
What level of what?
What level of mutation, like, are you still more percentage of human DNA than you are something else?
Let's say you're fully human, but you have a special superpower.
Yeah, like you might have something that's in quality of another animal, or whatever, but as long as you're still mostly human, 50% or more of your DNA is still traditionally human, I would think. But I don't know, we don't know what that would look like as far as like how it would affect their emotions and their thought processes and their body and everything.
Guys, I don't know any of this stuff either. I'm just really good at thinking about the question, but I don't know the answer. But these are burdens. This is what a burden is. If you're a thoughtful person, if you're considerate, this is the kind of thing you do. And you anticipate this, right? You do it before it happens. See, something like a work of art, like a good film, like the X-Men, that is fiction, right? That's like science fiction or whatever. You're thinking about a dystopia before it happens. Same thing was happening with something like 1984 with George Orwell or Animal Farm. Imagination plays a big role in conceiving possibilities and impossibilities and what those imply. So I'm just going to give you an overview. But I just want you to know that we're heading towards ethics, right? Historically, being a woman made you, in many ways, less than a person. I just want you to know that in many cultures, a woman is a commodity or some sort of piece of property involved in a transaction. Your father owns you, and then he negotiates on your behalf for who you're going to marry, and then dowry is exchanged, and you go to the other man and now you're that person's property. You understand what I'm saying? I'm not saying this is true or good, I'm just saying these are mentalities that are still with us. So is that a person? If you're treating someone like that, who's only destined to become a housewife, to be used for sexual pleasure, a bearer of children, is that a person? Let's look at race, right? Race is an interesting variable. If someone is a slave, I don't think I need to explain too much that we would question whether they're a person. Women weren't allowed to vote. And then neither were slaves, but the slave owner got a little bit more voting power based on how big his plantation was and how many slaves he had. So slaves were represented, but vicariously through their masters. So once again, you want to think about, hey, if my voting power is 2/5 of a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant male, what is that suggesting about my personhood, right? Okay, let's move on. Something like sexuality, same typical type of thing, right? Is a gay person even human? I mean, if you're willing to decapitate him or kill him because he's different, you know, that's suggesting something. You're treating him like an animal or something worse. Oh, while we're talking about animals, animal rights, right? Part of feelings, right? I don't know if plants can feel, but a big part of the animal rights movement is we have very delicate, sensitive feelings, and a puppy does too. I think most people agree that the puppy does. So if you torture a puppy, we now get offended. You know what I mean? It is obscene. If you record you torturing a puppy, you will go to jail in this country. Right? And it's based on what you were saying, feelings. We have empathy with the puppy, and we give it moral status, even if it's not a person. We still say that thing has feelings. And so even if it's not physical torture, but if you're like, I think if you're on camera verbally abusing a pet consistently for hours, I really think you can go to jail. I'm not totally, I don't have the background to really state what's going to happen to you if you do that on YouTube. If you upload to YouTube, what I do know is there was a lady who used to give little vlogs, and one day, I don't know what she was thinking, but she uploaded a video when she was in front of her camera. Her dog came and just kind of played with her while she was concentrating. She got so irritable that she like got a slipper and started beating it or whatever. And she uploaded it. I don't know what she was thinking. Okay, so first thing that happens, cancel culture, right? Got canceled, lost all her followers, blah, blah, blah. But then eventually, the animal, either ASPCA or whatever, they took the dog. So she didn't go to jail, but they did take the dog. So I'm just trying to let you know that when you mention emotions, it's not just the emotions of the victim, it's our empathy too. That's what's doing the moral work of standing up for that victim. You know what I mean? We feel their pain. So maybe one of the central things of being human is feeling, is the emotion part. All right? Let me see how much time I have left. Oh my God, 7:49. Okay, guys, so here's what's going on. I'm just going to summarize it. There's different schools of thought about what makes a person a person. I've given you the broad overview. I'm just going to slice through it right now. Some people say what you're made of is what makes you a person or not. If you're made out of matter, then so long as that matter has a certain functional structure or organization, you are a person for that duration. And when it decays or disassembles or disintegrates, you're no longer a person. These, of course, are materialists, right? It's called animism. This theory is called animism. And they basically say for as long as you're a living organism, then you're a person, and that's sufficient. And when that disintegrates, when you die, that's it, that's the end of your story. So obviously these people don't believe in an afterlife, right? There is no afterlife for this kind of personhood. All right, moving on. There are people who say, no, it's a soul. A person just is a soul. It's sufficient to be a soul. To be a person, all you gotta be is a soul. And the religious people are probably gonna join that camp, right? But the problem there is, okay, you can say that, but it's not really clear what a soul is. Think about empirically, right? If you're observing something, all you see is its physical structure. So a lot of people are going to say, I mean, you can throw around that term soul, but just like with ghosts and genies and all that stuff, we really don't know what you're talking about. Fairies, gremlins, you can say it, but if Socrates has a discussion with you, you're going to go home with your tail between your legs. Okay, fair enough, but I do want to suggest one other alternative, which is subjectivity. So remember, Descartes in his second Meditations, when he discovers that it's a thinking thing, well, what is thinking? Well, it's an activity, it's subjectivity. So you could say that what a soul is not a thing, it's just an activity, and it's a metaphysical activity. So that's one way to reply to the objection that we've never seen a soul, nor can we define it, nor do we know what it is. But that's just one response. So guys, there's a lot of detail, there's all sorts of, stories and different theories. To be a person is to be a brain, but then what if you can split a brain because it has two hemispheres? Does that make two people? I don't want to burden you with technicalities. I just want you to see there's a can of worms coming open, Pandora's box, and your burden is never lifted. Someone is always going to respond. You know what I mean? All right. So, guys, that's it, because being a person, some people are going to say, well, it's your memories. If you wipe away someone's memories, they're no longer the same person. And other people are going to say, no, it's not memories, it's intentions. So I want to stop here because time is over. And I actually think I've accomplished what I wanted to do, just to raise your consciousness about the general relevance of free will and determinism and personality for what is a person to what's coming, ethics, and also to kind of get you to see how burdens are created and how they're just shifted. But no one really thinks that a burden is ever lifted from a purely theoretical point of view. Now, from a practical point of view, we do throw off a burden. We're like, I'm not thinking about this anymore, I just gotta act. But that doesn't mean the burden has been lifted. That just means that as a human being, we're not just purely theoretical creatures, right? The practical side of things too. All right, any questions? Okay, so I'm gonna end right there and then take attendance.